I don't see many people I recognise, therefore, I'll just ask, who here has done any work on text data analysis of some sort? A couple. So most of you, this is all new stuff. Okay, so I'm a professor of artificial intelligence for language, which basically means that when they said, what title would you like? I thought AI sounds to be flavour of the month, so I put AI in there. And what I'm actually doing is I'm actually a linguist doing language analysis. So I could give you a talk about lots of different examples of use of this stuff, but I thought as an academic it'd be interesting to look at some of the underlying theory. So for statisticians, we like to do things with numbers, and text isn't numbers, it's completely different. So how do you represent text as numbers? Or rather, not just the text, but the meaning of the text. And I'm going to look at distributional lexical semantics as a way of extracting the meaning. But the problem is that gives you very, very large lots of numbers. So word embeddings is a way of compressing down a large set of numbers into a smaller set of numbers so you can handle it. I tend to speak too quickly. If I'm talking too quickly, just wave at me and say slow down. If there's anything I don't understand, stop me. Because I haven't got that much to say. I'm going to try and finish in what now? Yeah, perfect. Okay, so I want to give a flavour of some of the statistical modelling. I'm not a statistician. I have to say, I went to Lancaster University as an undergraduate, and we had to do 3 subjects. I did maths and computing and linguistics, and I thought maths was a bit boring, so I'll give up on that and stayed with computing and linguistics. But actually, you have to use a lot of maths and stats in linguistics and in computing. So text analytics is a sort of buzzword in industry for, like data analytics is data, and if you apply to text, then it's text analytics. It's basically data analytics or data mining or data visualization applied to text. And a collection, a data set of text is usually called a corpus. Corpus is a Latin word meaning a body. In medicine, corpus probably means something else, but in linguistics, a corpus is a collection of text. And the field is also known as, in computer science, if you look at the directory of terms, as natural language processing. If you're studying linguistics, then this would be called computational linguistics, or possibly corpus linguistics. If you're studying AI, and we have an AI degree scheme, then it's called AI for language. If you think this is interesting, then come and ask me afterwards. So, usually the problem, no matter what it is, if you're trying to decide an answer to a question or find all the documents which match your requirements in some way, or find if somebody likes you or doesn't like you, those sorts of general applications involve measuring similarity. We often want to measure if for 2 words or 2 pieces of text, how similar they are, how close they are in relatedness. And the obvious thing to do is just to look at the words as sequences of characters, and if a sequence of characters matches, then it must be close. So computer is the same as computer, computer here is the same as computer here. And if it's very, in English you can chop off the end, and compute is the root of computer, and compute is the root of computing, therefore they both have in common compute, therefore they must be similar. And that works a lot for English. It doesn't work so well for some other languages, but even for English there are all sorts of problems. One is that there are very often 2 words which look completely different but mean the same or very similar, like wedding and marriage. They're more or less the same thing, but they don't match in terms of characters. There's also the really big problem that a lot of words, a lot of character sequences have got more than one meaning or more than one sense. So bank, you can have a bio bank for putting bio in it, or if you're in a plane you can bank the plane, which means you turn, or there's a bank aside of a river. Or B-O-W is either bow or a bow and arrow, and those are completely different senses. So what we really want to do is measure similarity in meanings, not in character sequences. That means you have to have some way of representing the meaning, and usually in machine learning or data mining, each example, each instance has to be a vector of features, a vector, a sequence or a set, or usually a sequence of numbers. And if you have if you can represent the meaning as a vector of numbers, then you can apply standard mathematics So you can measure the distance between two vectors as Euclidean distance. Basically, you plot one vector here and another vector here, and draw a line between the two, and the length of that line tells you how similar they are. And if marriage is here and wedding is here, then wedding and marriage must be very similar. Whereas if marriage is here and wedding is here, then those two are far apart. So in data mining, you generally want to take a typical data mining problem is a classification task. You've got 1,000 examples of patient records, let's say, and you want to notice if two patient records or two parts of patient records are similar. And that means you have to represent the patient record as a set of features. So here's from the basic textbook example, this is patient records, rather the features that the doctor thinks is relevant for predicting heart attack. And things like the age, whether or not they smoke, whether or not they're having any pains, what their sex is, and are they having a heart attack? So usually the last feature is the thing you're trying to predict. And these are the features, and for any particular patient you have values, like age is young, smokes is no, pains is no, sex is not no but F for female, and heart attack question mark means we don't know. So we're trying to predict this thing. Can I just ask, is that feature representation familiar with anybody? Anybody done any data mining and seen this sort of thing? So if you do data mining, the most common thing in data mining is you have a whole load of data. Each item of data represents one example or one instance. And each item of data is made up of a number of attributes or features like this. And then the task is, usually one of those features is the important one, like usually the last one. There's some more spaces over here if you want to sit there. And that's what you're trying to predict. Ideally, if instead of having values like young and no, you've got numbers, then you can do this measurement of distance much more easily. So it's harder to say what's the distance between these two things, or things like this, because they're not numbers. But if they're numbers, then and that's what Google does, for example. Google represents each document as a vector of numbers. It represents your query as a vector of numbers, and then you can just measure the distance between those two vectors. But how do you convert a word or a document into a vector? Well, let's go with that. A short text, an example of a text, and in the textbooks, the examples are usually just 2 or 3 words. One thing is called one-hot encoding. Anybody heard of one-hot encoding? If you're an electronic engineer, you probably have. I think it's a bit of a silly name, really. Another way of, in computational linguistics, it's usually called a sort of bag of words representation. The idea is you don't really care what order the words come in, but you count up all the words in all of the documents. So here we have a set of 4 documents, just 2 words: a cat, a dog, a cat sat, and the dog woofed. The total vocabulary is a, cat, dog, sat, and woofed. Those are all the words that appear in all of the documents. So in this language, each document contains a bit of a language, but the entire language is those 5 words. That means that you can represent any document as a vector of 5 numbers. So a cat is, yes there is a, yes there is cat, and 0 there's no dog, there's no sat, and there's no woofed. So a cat becomes 1, 1, 0, 0, 0. A dog is similarly 1, 0, 1, 0, 0. A cat sat is 1, 1, 0, 1, 0. And a dog woofed is 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. Anybody not understand? Have I lost you yet? Okay, that's very simple, and it works. I teach a data mining text analytics course, and we introduce a very simple tool called Weka. It's nice and simple because you just press buttons, you don't have to do any programming. And this has got a number of classifiers and clusterers and other data mining tools. But before you can do that, you have to convert your data into the right format. So it includes a number of filters. For example, string to word vector filter will take a string of words like this and convert it into a vector like this. It basically takes all of the strings, counts up how many words there are, and builds a vocabulary, and then each individual string is represented as a vector like this. So string to word vector is available for you if you use Weka. In other programming languages like R and Python and so on, there are similar things, but you have to write a program for that. But this is this works after a fashion if you've got just very simple examples, but you can see hopefully that you've only got ones for the words which are in the string. And if you've got a lot of strings, then you're going to have lots of words which aren't in this particular string. So there's a real problem that real text uses many possible words. Most of a typical dictionary for English will have 50,000 to 100,000 words. Most of you must know probably more than 100,000 words because you're all academics. You're probably not even aware of it, but you do know lots of words. And that means if you want to have a vector which can encode any English document, it's got to have at least 100,000 values in it. And that's quite a large vector to do any processing with. It's also very sparse. Most of those are zeros, because for any particular document we'll only have a few of the words in it. Even if a document's 1,000 words long, it still has at most 1,000 words in it, and most of the others not there. So what you really want also is not the words, but the concepts, the meanings. Under this representation, you've still got the problem that wedding is different from marriage. Wedding might be vector number, item number 52, and marriage might be item number 75, and they're just different. So we want to have a way of doing string to meaning vector, taking a sentence as a string and convert it into a vector, a feature for each meaning. And we also want to have not just 100,000, but a much smaller number, like 1,000. If you're doing machine learning, each instance has 1,000 values. That's still quite hard. That's much harder than the example I just showed you with 5 features. So how can we do this? Well, one way is to use an ontology. Who's heard of an ontology? A few of you have. Okay. So an ontology is, people aren't going to like this, but an ontology is just the list of all the concepts in a particular area. So, for example, in medicine, there's SNOMED, the standard nomenclature of medicine. So some poor souls have had to spend a lot of time thinking up all the possible terms in medicine and putting them into a big list. It's actually a bit more than just a list because it's got there's links between things that are related. So I'm not a medic, so I'm going to make up something here. So there's chest and there's thoracic, and I think thoracic means the same thing as chest. Am I right? Or there's heart, and there's another word which I can't remember, which means heart. Cardiac. Cardiac. Yes, thank you. Right. Cardiac. So, but cardiac and heart have the same concept, even though they're different. Different character strings. So you can do that. My research team has focused on the Quran, which is an Arabic text holy to Islam. And if you click on this, you'll see there's a nice ontology of concepts in the Quran, and you can find all the verses to do with a particular concept. Okay, and that means if you have a tagger, like we had a PhD student, Saman here, who developed the SNOMED tagger. This basically went through a text, like a patient record, and whenever it came across a medical term, for every word it looked it up in SNOMED, and if it was a medical term, then it would add the tag, the label, from the ontology. And that means you've got, instead of having all the words, you just have to have the concepts. Now for the Quran ontology, there's only 1,000 or so concepts, and that works. So any Quranic verse can be mapped onto some vector containing only 1,000 possible concepts. Unfortunately for medicine, it's a bit more complicated. So SNOMED has got, last time I looked, over 300,000 concepts. So this is actually worse than just the words, because there's just too many medical concepts. So maybe that doesn't work. The reason for trying to do this, just by way of reminding you, is one reason is word sensedisambiguation, that any particular word can have many different senses, and you want to be able to work out which one it is and label that particular sense rather than the word itself. And this is important for all sorts of text applications. The obvious ones are in machine translation. Very often, if you want to translate from English into Spanish, one English word which has got 2 senses will have 2 different translations in the Spanish. Or the same thing for speech processing. To recognize how to pronounce this as bass or bass, or pronounce this as bow or bow, you have to know which sense you're meaning. And this is also important in spell checking. So if you want to, I can't figure out which one to spell out of principle and principle. or two, two and two, or weather and weather. They're basically the same word spelt differently with different senses. And you've got to work out which sense it is. And there's a very famous paper by Banco and Brill on how to do this with very large corpora. I'm mentioning Eric Brill because I'm Eric and he's Eric and we like each other. Okay, so here's an example of word senses. There's almost called WordNet, which has got all sorts of lexical word information in it, which you can use in text analytics. And it's very fine-grained in that, for example, the word bass or bass, it claims there are 8 different senses with very subtle differences, like there's the lowest part of the musical range, which is a slightly different sense from the lowest part in polyphonic music. If you're a musician, then maybe these are important differences. But actually, if you're doing machine translation, then all that matters is what are the different words in the target language. So, for example, if you're translating into Spanish, it turns out the various different fish senses of bass are pronounced lubina, and the various different musical senses of bass are pronounced bajo. Do we have any Spanish speakers here? Did I say that right? Thank you. Got it. Okay. So how do you work out which one it is? Is it the fish or the music? Well, this goes back to information theory from Weaver in 1955. He thought essentially what the task is, if you blank out all of the text except for the word itself and 1 or 2 words on either side, then you can work out how big a window do you need to be able to work out which sense it is. Here's an example. Dishes can either be items of food, or they can be the plates that they're on. Or bass can either be a fish or music. Just looking at the words themselves, you can't tell. But maybe if you look at one word on either side, maybe there's enough context. So here we have washing dishes, full stop. Is that food or is that plates? Who thinks that's food? Who thinks that's plates? It's clearly plates. It's because the word washing only comes with plates. You can't wash, you can't wash a cooked dishes means a cooked item of food. Okay, what about simple dishes including? Who thinks that's food? And who thinks that's plates? Well, this is a bit more subtle because cooking food is quite complicated. Therefore, you can have simple and complicated, whereas plates aren't simple or complicated. So that's another convenient dishes too. Who thinks that's plates? Who thinks that's food? You're getting it? Okay, so you can see that the words around it, it's not just the obvious words, like if you have the word fish, then it's going to be bass, or cook is going to be the food. But there are all sorts of words which could appear in the context which give you subtle clues. And the same thing for bass. Free bass with, who thinks that's a fish? Who thinks that's music? Yeah. It's actually quite difficult to tell. That's partly because the words on either side have to be content words, nouns or verbs or adjectives. If it's a preposition like with, then that doesn't give you enough information. So of dishes and is another example. There's no way of telling which one that is. So for those, you have to go to a much wider context. And sometimes the context is the entire sentence, or perhaps it's just 2 words on either side is enough. So you have to have, most of the time, 2 words on either side is enough to give you the context, it's enough to give you the meaning. That means you can represent the meaning of dish as having 2 different meanings. Dish, the food dish, is somehow represented by all the context that food appears in, and the plate sense of dish is represented by all the context that the plates type of dish comes in. Okay, and there's bass, the example. You can see, looking at the context more widely, if you give the whole sentence, you can usually tell, but even just having 2 words on either side is usually enough. So, you want to be able to represent the meaning of a word by a set of features, or a vector of features. So, each of the vectors has to be a set of features and the values of those features, and these vectors have to represent the meaning of a word as the context or the window of words around that target. But the window of words around those are words themselves. So going back to the one-hot representation of a sentence, rather than representing a one-hot representation of a sentence, you represent a one-hot representation of all the different 2-word contexts that a particular word came in. So a word like fish, bass, you can look it up in a large corpus and find all the pairs of words on either side which come with the fish sense, and that is a representation of the meaning of the fish sense of bass. And then you look at the other sense of bass and find all the words that appear in that context. So how do you represent, how do you know what are the relevant words which tell you that it's fish, that the dish is a food rather than a plate? Well, we just saw it's food if the word food appears, but there are other subtle things, like it's complicated, or it's, what was the other one? Washing is something only goes with plates. So there's many words which can be clues either way. So you basically want to include every possible word in your feature vector. So all words that are there, for Google, they have to have even bigger than 100,000 words. This does give very sparse vectors, but you end up with a vector, a very large vector, and the very large vector represents the meaning of the word by having a 1 for every context word which appears in the context of that word, and a 0 for all the other words which can't appear in the context. It's still a one-hot representation, but this time it's representing the meaning of the word rather than just representing a text. Having got that very large vector of 100,000 or more, we still have the problem that we can't really do any computation on vectors of 100,000. We want to have vectors of maybe 400 or at most 1,000 numbers. If you've got a vector of 1,000 numbers, then you can compare two vectors and work out how far or what apart they are. If it's 100,000, then it's much slower. So this is where the idea of word embedding came along, made popular by Mikolov, who worked at Google originally and then moved off to Facebook, presumably because they paid him more money. He developed this tool called Word2Vec, and very cleverly he made it openly available for anyone to use, and lots of people are using it. Word embedding is the collective name for a set of language modeling and feature learning techniques in natural language processing, where words or phrases from the vocabulary are mapped to vectors of real numbers. I've just shown you how to map a word into a vector of real numbers, but the clever thing is, conceptually involves a mathematical embedding from a space with one dimension per word to a continuous vector space with a much lower dimension. So rather than having one value for every possible word, you somehow merge together words which are similar, so you end up with a representation where any particular value isn't linked to just one word, but it has a distributed representation of several words. And that's done in a neural network. Essentially takes as input vectors of 100,000 or so, and as output vectors of 1,000, and by clever jiggery-pokery, it compresses the 100,000 numbers into 1,000 numbers for any particular word description. So that's essentially the word embedding bit. So this distributional semantics is getting 100,000 a vector of 100,000 representing the meaning of a word, and then word embedding is compressing that down into 400 or 1,000 numbers. So Word2Vec does this by deep learning of word embeddings. It can then find similar words or documents without having to do any sort of complicated word sensedisambiguation mechanism. Essentially, if you have a word and you convert it into a word embedding of 1,000 numbers, and another word converted into a word embedding of 1,000 numbers, then you can measure the distance between those two words very straightforwardly. And hopefully, the word embedding for wedding and the word embedding for marriage should be similar by this mechanism. Of course, that's just a word. What about a whole document? Well, you might think the simplest thing to do is if you have a vector for each word, if you just add together vectors, then the sum of those vectors gives you a representation of the meaning of the sentence. It's still a bit weird in that it doesn't take into account the word order. So John loves Mary means exactly the same as Mary loves John, which means exactly the same as John Mary loves. It makes no difference what order the words were, because in most cases, if you're, for example, Googling to find all the documents on a particular topic, it doesn't matter what order the words are in. The document will still match. So the document is got by adding together the vectors, And the distance between two documents is just the distance between two vectors. If you can represent the query as a vector, then you can measure the distance between the query and each document. If you've got 1,000,000 documents, you just have to go through the 1,000,000 documents and find the ones which match both. You do need to have, to do this, remember I said you have to have examples of the word and its context. So for example, for dish, that's it. For dish, you need to have, let's say, at least 1,000 examples of the word dish and what words occur for each of those, what words occurred before and after it. So you have 1,000 contexts, and you put these all into the one hot vector. To get 1,000 examples of every word, you have to have a very large corpus, because words like the and of and, there's plenty of examples of those. But then there's this thing called Zipf's law, which means that the most common words are very frequent, but there's a long tail of lesser words which are very rare, and you have to have millions of words of text to get a few examples, and billions of words of text to get 1,000 examples. Luckily, Google has access to the World Wide Web, so they've now been able to capture billion-word corpora of English, but also even obscure languages like French or Arabic or Spanish. They've got those as well. Essentially, you can do all this by cranking the algorithm, counting up all these frequencies, doing the statistics, and there you are. You've got a simple way of capturing the meaning, doing word sense disambiguation. You don't need linguistic theory. So a lot of the stuff I learned as an undergraduate in linguistics is no longer necessary. You don't need to know anything about grammar and syntax and formal semantics and all this other stuff. Just count up things and there you are. There's a very famous saying by Fred Jelinek, who headed the language and speech research team, something along the lines that every time I fire a linguist, the performance of the speech recognition system goes up. The linguists would say you need to know these subtle things about syntax. Word order is important. John loves Mary does not mean the same thing as Mary loves John. But actually, if we ignore that, most of the systems still work 99% of the time. And I think I'll stop there. Okay, so we have a conclusion. Distributional lexical semantics is a way of representing the meaning of a word or a text or a document as a vector capturing the other words found in the context. So it's distributional, it depends on the distribution of a word. So you take, again, 1,000 examples of a word, look at the words around it, and the words around it capture the meaning of that word. So that marriage will occur around, various other words will appear around marriage, and hopefully more or less the same sorts of words will appear around wedding. Therefore, marriage and wedding will have the same similar vectors. And you have to capture this in a very large corpus, which is why Leeds, a long time ago, led the way in capturing multi-million word corpora of all these languages for translational studies, but they're now widely used for capturing lexical semantics. And a word embedding is a neural network way of compressing very large vectors of 100,000 or so into much smaller vectors of 1,000 or even 400, using neural network magic. And nobody knows how it works, but it works. If you're a mathematician, you might understand how it works, but we don't care how it works as long as it works. And that means the word embedding of marriage should be a vector close to the word embedding of wedding if they have similar context in a large corpus. And I think I'll stop there because I've gone half an hour. Yeah?
Thanks very much.
I should say, if you want to find out more, I think LIDA is running a training course later on this month, and in the second semester 2, I'm teaching a 15-credit MSc module on data mining and text analytics, so sign up for the module.
We have 10 minutes for questions now. Eric, you're well used to this, so I'll let you kind of share the floor and I'll just let you know when the 10 minutes is up. So do you have any questions?
How do you measure distance when you've got a sum of lots of words versus so you've got the length of the text obviously matters, you take a sum. So how do you measure distance? Is it an angle distance, or is it a Euclidean distance, or how do you measure distance?
You're right, there are many different ways of measuring distance. Euclidean distance seems to work reasonably well most of the time. So you basically have if each word is a vector of 400 numbers, there's 400 dimensions. So a particular word is a point in 400-dimensional space, and another word is another point in 400-dimensional space, and you can draw a line between the two or measure that distance. And the way to measure the distance depends on what the application is. So what Google have done is they've tried all sorts of different metrics, and they try a new metric on California, let's say, and if users in California say, oh, Google works better now, then they spread it out to everywhere else. So exactly how they do it, nobody knows except for Google. But for most purposes, any straightforward metrics will do.
There's, of course, the famous book, Eats, Shoots, and Leaves. You know this book? How does the methodology deal with that sort of ambiguity?
Okay, well, because it's drowned out by the vast number of ordinary sentences. So most statistics, these sort of basic line statistical methods seem to work most of the time. And I've been to academic conferences where say, well, about this particular method you should be using, you should be aware of commas or punctuation or other things, but they actually they work for the particular examples you give, but then they cause more problems for other examples where the simple method works. So unfortunately, Each, Shoots and Leaves is a nice joke for that particular book, but
well, maybe the answer is different. When you do a Google search, you don't look for one answer, you look for a list of answers, and you hope that at least one of them addresses your particular concern. So if your query is ambiguous, you're happy for multiple answers to come back, provided you, as a knowing person, can pick out the one you care about.
yeah, unfortunately, Google at the moment isn't very well personalized. So my son particularly, for example, complains that he's got a very specific, different need. So if you type Eats, Shoots and Leaves into Google, it will give you the particular, it will order the web pages so that ones near the top are the ones that most people click on so they think that's the right answer. But unfortunately, if you have a particular different sort of need, then it won't give you that. So ideally, you'd like Google to know, to personalize your results to your particular previous habits.
Can I say, I suppose, on that about the use of this when it's done, and maybe you can speak about some of the stuff in the medical domain about the SNOMED and things. When we've done this, so we have this associative process to associate words and documents with different concepts. What do we then do with it? Do we just leave it up to the user to decide what they do with it, or is it being used as input for some other process?
So, as I said at the beginning, most text analytics practical applications involve usually in some way measuring distance between two things. So, for example, for the Quran website, users want to find all the verses relating to Friday prayers, let's say. And that may be that the actual English translation has got the phrase Friday prayers in it, or it may be that there's an ontology concept in the verse, even though the word Friday isn't there. Or it may be that it's so you typically, I mean, there's lots of applications of language processing. If you want to classify, if you want to emails coming in and I want to put all the bad ones in a spam folder, that means I've got to find out somehow which ones are like spam and which ones are not like spam. So usually any classification task involves measuring distance or similarity in some way.
Neural nets of different types behave very differently. You haven't said what kind.
I'm not going to. That's a different lecture. Okay. I've only had half an hour or less. No, in fact, one of the nice things about the Weka toolkit is that you can use typically, unless you're a machine learning researcher, you don't care how the algorithm works. You just want accurate results. So in Weka, you can just try 10 different algorithms and plot which one is best for your particular data set or problem. And within sort of neural network research, there are issues about which one works best. But I leave that up to the experts, and they use whichever one works for me. That's a cheat answer. Yeah.
So you said that we compress large vectors that represent a word, so 100,000 down to 1,000-ish size. how do we know? So how, because is it a supervised learning or an unsupervised learning? Like, how do we know what representation we do want for this, for a certain word? To kind of
It's
teach
unsupervised learning.
Right. Okay.
So, yeah, I think that's right, yes. But so we don't know, it comes up with a representation, a vector of 1,000 numbers. Nobody knows what each of those values mean in some sense, except that the vector of numbers for wedding should be quite similar to the set of numbers for marriage. And that what Mikolov did is he tried this out on lots of different pairs of words and found where pairs of words are similar. In fact, even better than that, if you take the vector for, let's get this right, if you take the representation for king and then add on the vector for woman, you get a vector which is very close to queen. So there's you can actually add together these vectors and get the vectors for other words which mean the combination of the meanings of the two words. Okay, shall I stop now?